I'd like to welcome you to a tour of Natural Forces, Homer and Remington. This is the first time the artist's works have been considered together. The exhibition was organized by the Denver Art Museum, the Portland Museum of Art in Portland, Maine, and the Amon Carter Museum of American Art in Fort Worth, Texas.
The exhibition begins with 4 paintings, 2 by each artist, that set the visual and thematic tones for what is to come. Iconic artworks, these reveal the subjects for which both artists would become best known, Homer for his seascapes and Remington for his depictions of the American West. Further, these intentional pairings reveal the resonances between their formal techniques, their use of color, their vigorous brushstrokes, and their ability to evoke the drama of some of America's wildest spaces.
The first section of the exhibition is titled War and Illustration. Winslow Homer and Frederick Remington both began their careers as illustrators, particularly covering war for popular magazines. A young Winslow Homer traveled south to cover the American Civil War, and about 20 years later, Frederick Remington would cover the pursuit of Geronimo in the American Southwest. He also traveled to Cuba to cover the Spanish-American War. It was their experiences as illustrators that gave them a practical rather than a formal training in art. It also made them household names that everyone in the country knew.
Homer moved to New York City in 1859, where he was first employed by the popular illustrated periodical Harper's Weekly, which had been founded just 2 years before in 1857. In 1861, the American Civil War broke out, and Harper's sent Homer to the Civil War front as a war reporter. Homer was embedded with the Army of the Potomac, a photograph of which you see here. And while embedded, he produced a range of imagery that captured the drama of men charging into battle, imagery that captured quiet moments around the campfire waiting for the next day's battle. One of his most iconic works from his Civil War period is this, The Sharpshooter, published in November of 1862. It presents a man alone, perched in a tree, looking down the barrel of his gun at a Confederate soldier, someone who not that long before had been a brother, a cousin, most certainly a fellow citizen. From his Civil War experiences, Homer drew for his first major oil paintings, the first of which was Sharpshooter, rendition of this image, which he exhibited in 1863. During the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, much of Homer's work spoke to the hope of a healing nation. Consider, for example, his iconic work, Snap the Whip from 1872. Here we see a number of young Americans, kids who were born during or right after the American Civil War, who are not tainted by that experience like many of their parents had been. Here, these kids play amidst a nature that is green, that is fertile. This image underscores the hope of this healing nation.
Much like Winslow Homer, Frederick Remington covered war for popular magazines. Between 1898 and 99, Remington traveled to Cuba to cover the Spanish-American War for Collier's magazine. There, he followed Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders as far as the Battle of San Juan Hill. As a young man, Frederick Remington often celebrated war in his mind. However, seeing death on the battlefield would change the tenor of his works. Less often, his Western subjects would have highlighted conflict. Just after the war, he begins a series of nocturne paintings, which would ultimately become some of his most celebrated. Now, Remington would never really stop selling his imagery for illustration. An example of which you see here, this great painting, will become the cover of Century magazine in 1902. Winslow Homer and Frederick Remington's lives overlap most closely in New York City, where they established themselves as illustrators and painters, and in the North Country, the wooded region around the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York and into Quebec. It was there that the artist found solace and enjoyed hunting and fishing. Now, it's obvious that we would associate Winslow Homer with the Northeast. However, it will come as a surprise to many viewers that Frederick Remington is such a New Yorker because of his Western subjects.
We cannot fully appreciate the works Homer and Remington produced in and about the North Country without understanding the context of the industrialized Eastern Seaboard. There was a real sense at this time that the crush and the noise and the dirt of the urban environment and the kinds of high-stress jobs people worked there risked the mental and physical health of urban dwellers. Thus, escaping to nature became an important way to find restoration and solace, a way to remedy the stress of the urban environment. What you see here on this wall are two works on paper, one by each artist, that demonstrate the sport and the solace found in the North Country. Behind these works is a photograph of New York City that demonstrates that crush, that congestion. These stand in contrast to each other and help us better understand why city dwellers would have appreciated and wanted to purchase these kinds of works. If you didn't have the time to escape to nature, let's say you are one of the high-powered businessmen who are frequenting the Century Association or the Union League Club, where Homer is exhibiting these kinds of paintings, well, you would want to own something like this for the benefit of the vicarious restoration you could enjoy from the comfort of your own home.
Frederick Remington's closest artist friends were a group of American Impressionists, which he stated put a spell on him. In the later years of his life, he becomes increasingly interested in landscapes and painting outdoors. But he lamented that the public wouldn't accept them because they didn't have Western subjects.
The third section of the exhibition is entitled Natural Forces. In the art of Homer and Remington, nature is not always a place of solace. And increasingly, into the 1880s and 1890s, their work channeled a more dramatic depiction of man in and against nature. In these works, nature is an aggressive protagonist against which man must be tried. This idea, which is reflected in their artworks, speaks to a moment in time in which survival of the fittest and the strenuous life were hotly debated. After 25 years in New York City, in 1884, Homer moved north to Prouts Neck, Maine, where he lived for the rest of his life until his death in 1910. Around the same time as this move, during the mid-1880s, he undertook a series of paintings that focused on the topic of seaside rescue. One of these, Undertow from 1886, you see here. This painting was inspired by a rescue scene that Homer himself had witnessed, but he's not interested in the factual details of a historical event. Rather, he's interested in channeling his own artistic vision to articulate the power of these sculptural human forms that rise up against the scintillating wave of nature's own force.
The transition from illustrator to painter is something that Remington aspired to from the beginning. However, the full transition would be decades in the making. Among his first successes is this painting, A Dash for the Timber, from 1889. The critics lauded it for its unbridled action. A holdover from his illustration days, Remington knew he could use action to hold the audience's attention.
I remember well the first time I saw this painting at the Sid Richardson Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. Faced with this explosion of color and sculptural brushstrokes, I thought to myself, this is not the Remington I thought I knew. You see, many of Remington's most iconic works are from the early part of his career, the 1880s and the 1890s, when he's working in a more hard-edged style and is very committed to recording accuracy and detail, certainly a legacy of his work as an illustrator. During this first decade of the 20th century, Remington is spending significant time with the American Impressionists. And he's a savvy artist. He's looking around and he's observing changing artistic trends. Increasingly, he adopts the working methods of the American Impressionists. He loosens up his technique. He works in blocks of color over which he layers gestural brushstrokes, finishing the very end with what he called his final vibrations, perhaps seen best in this painting on the evidence of sweat on the horse's neck and shoulder. Remington wrote in his journal that he had always wanted to be able to paint running horses as if you could feel the details and not see them. This he beautifully accomplishes by the time of this painting, 1909, just 20 years after A Dash for the Timber, and which was featured in a solo exhibition at M. Knoedler and Company Gallery in New York City. At this time, Remington received the praise as a fine artist that he had so long desired. In the words of one critic, Royal Corteses, Remington had, under a burning sun, worked out an impressionism all his own. After having received the praise he had desired, Remington unexpectedly passed away the end of this same year.
The final section of the exhibition is titled Forever Looming. Around the turn of the 20th century, America faced dramatic changes due to modernization, urbanization, and immigration. Partly as a response to these changes, Homer and Remington create some of their most compelling works. Although born a generation apart, Homer and Remington die within a year of one another. Homer dies at the age of 74 in 1910, and Frederick Remington dies unexpectedly at the age of 48 in 1909. During the final decade, Homer paints prodigiously in watercolor, but he creates few but significant oils. It's during this decade that Remington creates his most sophisticated paintings, becomes a celebrated sculptor as well as author. Evolving beyond their illustrator beginnings, both move past direct narrative toward more symbolic visual language, the impact of which is both haunting and self-revealing. While Winslow Homer and Frederick Remington were painters first, we also know them as celebrated for a second medium, Homer in watercolor and Frederick Remington in bronze sculpture. Remington had no formal training as a sculptor. In his first attempt at the medium, he gave us one of the most iconic bronzes in American art history with the Bronco Buster in 1895. Around 1900, Remington met a young foundryman named Riccardo Bertelli, who was establishing a foundry in Brooklyn. The Roman bronzework foundry would introduce to America the ancient technique of lost wax casting. Remington becomes one of the most experimental sculptors during this period, and his relationship with Bertelli is one of the most interesting chapters in American art history, where you have a foundryman and a sculptor working so closely, both pushing the limits of the medium. One of the great examples is cast number 3 of the Cheyenne from the Denver Art Museum, which you see here. It has all the hallmarks of Remington's experimental style. The great texture that you see here, as well as the gold and the green patination.
For the last 25 years of his life, Homer lived at Prouts Neck, Maine. There, from the studio in which he lived, he could observe the ocean in all of its moods during each season and at different points of the day. He had a very specific moment in mind for this painting, the moment after the sun has set, when it leaves behind a red glow on the horizon. He spent many evenings on the seashore waiting for just this moment until he got it just right, making this painting, in his own opinion, one of the best he ever did.
During the last decade of his life, Remington returns again and again to painting moonlight. His nocturne paintings are among his most celebrated critically. Among the things he learned from his nocturne painting was to simplify, and that through simplification, the paintings would gain clarity and power. He wrote in 1903, "Big art is a process of elimination. Cut down and out. Do your hardest work outside the picture, and let your audience take away something to think about, to imagine." This work, titled In From the Night Herd of 1907, is among my favorite paintings by Frederick Remington, as it typifies the temperament of his late pictures. During this period, Remington is more interested in the symbolic subjects rather than direct narrative. In this picture, he returns to a familiar subject of a cowboy, yet before, they're never quite so ominous.
Thank you for spending your time with us today. We hope you enjoyed this tour of natural forces, Winslow Homer and Frederick Remington.